If everybody would like to take their seats, we'll go ahead and get started. I'd like to welcome everyone here this evening. Good evening. I'm Laura Newman. I'm Batavia's City Administrator. And thank you for everybody for attending this Home Rule Information meeting. I look out into this crowd and I see a lot of familiar faces who I have seen come to City Council meetings and Committee of the Whole meetings, and also some new faces that I haven't seen here before. So I'm really glad that everybody came out, because this is a very important issue for our community. We want to take some time so that you can learn the facts about Home Rule, so that when you go to the polling place on November 6th, that you can make an informed position on a very important matter to the city, its finances, and also your property taxes. This meeting is being broadcast on BATV tonight, and it is also being recorded by BATV, so that your friends and neighbors who maybe couldn't attend this meeting tonight are going to be able to view it by accessing it through the BATV website at mybatv.com. Also, I wanted just to, the presentation, I wanted to start with this slide. And it is very important, and we want to strictly adhere to the fact that the City of Batavia may not use public resources either to advocate for or against the referendum. However, we do want to make sure that we are providing you with the facts that you need to know in order to make an informed decision on voting day. I'd like to introduce the panelists that I have with me here tonight. Introduce myself, Laura Newman, City Administrator. Sitting next to me is Peggy Colby. She is our Director of Finance, and Daniel is our Chief of Police, and Kevin Drendel is our City Attorney. Both Peggy has a part of the presentation that she will talk about the finances aspects of Home Rule, and then also the Chief of Police is here to talk about the legislative matters that are associated with Home Rule, and one of the primary ones would be our crime-free housing program. And we also have two facilitators here tonight. One you may have met as you came in the door is Anthony. He's actually my assistant. And then we also have Chris Cudworth, who is wandering around here too. Chris is our communication coordinator, just making sure that everybody has a copy of this handout. If you need a handout, ask Chris or Anthony for a copy and they will get one for you. The handout contains all of the information that is on the slides tonight and a little bit more detail. So be sure to take a copy of this home with you. We know that we're going to be presenting a lot of information here tonight, and so we wanted to give you a comprehensive handout that you could take with you that had additional information so that you could have access to that later. The agenda for this evening, we want to cover exactly what is going to be on the ballot when you see it and you go to vote, and you understand the way the question is worded, and then which answer to that question you should select depending upon what your position is. We're also going to talk about what are the key differences between home rule units of government and non-home rule units of government. And then we're going to take some time to answer any questions that you may have. Now, the format for the question and answer session, as you came in and have been sitting here, Anthony and Chris Cudworth have been asking you if you want a note card and or a pen to write down the questions. We did the question and answer in this format to maximize the number of questions that we're going to be able to answer for you tonight instead of waiting and the transition at the podium. We hope that this will allow us to answer as many questions as possible. The other reason why we wanted to have the questions written down is in the event that we don't have enough time to get to everyone's questions before we get to 9 p.m., I've got them written down. We can do a document where we will be sure to answer every one of those questions and make that available to you on our website. And we hope to get all those questions answered by the end of the week and create a Q&A document for you. So the first thing we'd like to look at is the referendum question. The way that the referendum question is worded comes directly from the statute. There is no choice as to how the question is worded. But we find, and we've had some feedback, that some people find the question a little confusing because it's kind of written in the negative. So the question is, shall the city of Batavia cease to be a home rule unit? And we've done some call-outs there to help you know which answer reflects what position. So if you vote yes to the referendum question, this means that you are in favor of the city losing home rule. And if you vote no, this means that you are in favor of the city keeping home rule. So, maybe you keep that part of the handout as a reminder when you go that day to vote so that you can be clear on which response is which position. So the next thing I'd like to start with is the basics of home rule. Where did it come from? Well, back in 1970, Illinois adopted a new constitution, and one of the changes that was part of that new constitution was to allow units of government to become home rule, either by referendum or automatically if they attain more than 25,000 population. And the Constitution provides that, except as limited by this section, a home rule may exercise any power and perform any function pertaining to its government and affairs, including but not limited to the power to regulate for the protection of public health, safety, morals, and welfare, to license, to tax, and to incur debt. I think one of the primary differences between home rule and non-home rule can be explained that units of home rule can exercise authority unless they're expressly prohibited or preempted by state or federal law. By contrast, non-home rule units may only exercise authority that's expressly given to them. So Batavia automatically became home rule in 2009 when its population exceeded 25,000. There are some limits to home rule authority, and those are that a home rule unit may not incur debt payable from property taxes maturing more than 40 years after the debt is incurred. They may not define and provide for punishment of a felony. And they can't do the following without legislative authority: punish by imprisonment for more than 6 months, license for revenue except as explicitly allowed by the General Assembly, tax, income, earnings, or occupations. And then finally, home rule units may not do the following without a referendum. It applies to our form of government. We can't adopt, alter, or repeal our form of government without a referendum, nor can we change the type of city officers or the manner of selection of those city officers. Now, this slide points out some of the key differences between home rule and non-home rule as it pertains to certain aspects of government. First of all, the ability to raise revenues. A home rule unit can create diverse alternative sources of revenue to address the need for additional financial resources. A non-home rule unit can only raise property tax or implement taxes and fees that are explicitly allowed by statute. And then debt is another way that home rule and non-home rule differ. A home rule unit can incur debt without a referendum, but a non-home rule needs a referendum to issue what's called general obligation bonds. These are bonds that are backed by property taxes. But it can incur other types of debt either with a backdoor referendum or no referendum, depending on the type of debt. And backdoor referendum, just so you know, is one where the city can elect to incur the debt, and it may do so unless there is a petition for a referendum. So as long if there are a sufficient number of signatures, then even though the city council has elected to incur the debt, they have to wait until the referendum and see whether that would pass. The next area of difference is property taxes. Home rule units are not limited by the property tax cap laws called PTEL, and the non-home rule are subject to PTEL, or the property tax cap laws. And finally, in its legislative authority. So a home rule unit have broad authority to implement local ordinances that cover local matters. And non-home rule units only have the authority to enact laws that have been specifically granted to them. So the rest of the presentation has basically been organized into the format of these following 4 topics. So Peggy's going to talk a little bit more about revenue, debt, and property tax, and how home rule has been applied in the city of Batavia with regard to those items. And then Chief Ewell is going to talk about the legislative authority and what the city's experience has been implementing the crime-free housing program. So with that, I will turn it over to Peggy.
Good evening, everyone. So the home rule revenues that the city has enacted since 2009 have been a half-a-cent home rule sales tax that was implemented in 2014. It was initially implemented to supplement the electric utility in order to avoid a rate increase, and it was planned over a 4-year period. And so that just ended this last year. Sorry, I can't see that either way. Yes, thank you. So in 2017, we began using those revenues for operations. Also, part of our home rule sales tax, in 2005, there was a referendum if we should issue or enact a home rule or non-home rule sales tax to fund the construction of the fire stations. And that was approved, and so it was implemented in 2006. And then in 2009, when we became home rule, we converted the non-home rule sales tax to a home rule sales tax. And that is in part because non-home rule sales tax is restricted to certain uses, and a home rule sales tax can be used for operations overall. And then also in 2012, we refunded the fire station bonds for a savings of $629,000 in order to save the interest over the remaining life of those bonds. And we did not pledge the sales tax at that time, even though we continued to use the sales tax to pay the debt. Then we implemented a gas tax in 2012 for 1 cent and have increased it over the last few years to where it is now 4 cents. That money is required to be used only for streets, and that's a state law that it only be used for streets, and that is what we are using it for. That provides $825,000. I should have said the combined total of the non-home rule or the home rule sales tax is $3.8 million. Then we have a liquor tax that was enacted in 2016, and that is providing $375,000. That's 2% on all sale of alcoholic beverages in the city, whether you're in a restaurant or in a store. Video gaming is rather new. We have slightly higher licensing fees than what would be allowed for a non-home rule entity, but it's such a minor amount that really doesn't have an impact on the budget, but we still wanted to disclose that. And then our natural use gas, we converted to a gas use tax in order to collect the tax on those that use an alternative gas supplier. The way the law is written, if you're a non-home rule entity, we can't collect it from those that don't use an ICOR. seems kind of a strange part of the law, but that is how it is. And so this actually makes it so that everybody that's using natural gas pays the same amount. And what I'd like to point out here is that many of these taxes are paid for by other than residents of Batavia, although residents of Batavia would also pay these taxes. Others that come into our community, eat at our restaurants or shop in our stores, also contribute to support to help pay for our roads because they drive on our streets, they help pay for it. So home rule revenues. When someone looks at our budget and looks at our total revenues, it's a little confusing because the city is made up of what we call funds, but it's basically a bunch of smaller companies with one parent company, and the city of Batavia is the parent company. But the day-to-day operations of the city are paid out of what we call the general fund. So that pays for police, fire, streets, and administration of the city. And the revenues of that fund are $27.5 million. All of the home rule taxes go into that fund. So the large pie shows all of our revenues, and then the call-out shows what portion of that is home rule. So if we were to lose home rule, the city could not restore the liquor tax, the gas tax, or the natural gas use tax because we wouldn't be allowed legislatively to do that. The city could restore home rule sales tax by putting a referendum on as non-home rule sales tax. And then whether or not it would be approved would, be subject to the referendum. Alternative revenue sources that we would look at would be a places for eating tax, vehicle stickers possibly, stormwater utility, increases to permits, fees, licenses, and those kinds of things. So alternatively, the city would look at certainly cutting its spending. So I just wanted to give a breakdown of how the city spends its money in the general fund. 27 million, of the 27 million, 13.5 million is for salaries and benefits. I'm sorry, 13.5 million is salaries and 6.4 million is benefits. The pensions are state mandated. We're required to fund the pensions, and that represents a large portion of those benefits. So those two numbers account for 73% of our operations. We are very heavily concentrated with humans and not contracts or supplies. So most departments now still have fewer employees than when we went through the recession in 2009. Citywide, we cut 26 positions in 2009. In the general fund, I think it was about 16 positions. So the remaining portion of the budget is capital and debt and transfers to capital funds of $1.8 million. We know right now that we still need more funding for our streets because of the age of our streets. A lot of the streets were built in the 80s, and they're needing resurfacing. So we would be looking to put more funding towards that if we had the ability. And so operating costs are $5.5 million. Aside from those other numbers, that supports TRICOM, which is our dispatch service that we have shared with Geneva and St. Charles and a few other communities, Tri-City Ambulance, brush pickup, property maintenance, forestry, support of BATV, animal control, and maintenance are some of the major contracts that we have. And then the remaining portion is for utilities, fuel, phones, road salt, road materials, and those kinds of things. So supplies and contracts only account for $5.5 million. So it's not a large portion of the city's spending. You were going to cover this, Laura, or I can too?
Help me when I get in trouble. So there are two ways that cities fund larger projects. They can create a capital fund. It's like a savings account, and then money is put into that savings account every year, and once there's a sufficient amount in there, they'll begin the project. Other times, because a project needs to get done probably sooner rather than later, the city might fund a project by incurring debt. And they might do that either by taking out a loan or issuing bonds. And bonds typically carry a lower interest rate than getting a loan from a bank. So that would be preferable. Also, general obligation bonds, as I said before, those are the ones that are backed by property taxes. Those typically carry a lower interest rate than alternative revenue bonds, like pledging sales tax or some other revenue stream to back the bonds. Whatever the type of debt, home rule units of government typically receive a lower interest rate than non-home rule units of government because they're not subject to the property tax cap, and they have this ability to generate alternate revenue sources that non-home rule units are not allowed to. On the next slide, Peggy talked about this a little bit, but I think it's a really good way of demonstrating the way that Batavia has used its home rule status to lower the cost of incurring debt. So, as she said, in 2006, by referendum, the city implemented a 0.5% non-home rule sales tax, pledged to pay for the alternate revenue bonds that were issued to build the east side and west side fire stations. And once it became home rule in 2009, that gave the city the ability to convert those. So it was kind of like, I guess, refinancing your home. We were able to convert those alternate revenue bonds into home rule GO bonds. So as I said, the GO bonds carry the lower interest rate than the revenue bonds. And when we did that, then the interest savings over the life of the bonds because of the lower interest rate is going to be $639,000 over the remaining life of the bond. So that was something good that we were able to do there. And then since we've become home rule, the only general obligation bonds that have been issued actually were in for this year's budget. We issued GO bonds for $6 million, and that was to fix drainage problems in Ward 1, which is prone to it floods often, and so we needed to get those repairs done to keep those homes from flooding. But then the other was Area 3, and in Area 3 we have what are combined sewer and stormwater, and that meant that when things backed up for those people, they were getting sewage in their homes. So it was a problem that we wanted to take care of quickly, and so we issued the debt. $5 million of it was for the drainage problems, and then $1 million was to cover the cost of replacing the windows and doing tuck pointing here at City Hall. I'll shift back to you for property tax.
So this is just touching on the fact that home rule cities have the ability to raise property taxes without tax cap limits, and that is something that's a concern to everyone. No one wants to pay higher property taxes, but just generally over Illinois, statewide, studies have shown that a majority of home rule units do not increase property taxes any more than non-home rule communities. The city of Batavia has levied $100,000 more than it could have as being non-home rule over the 9-year period, primarily because this last year we increased taxes to cover a portion of those bonds that were issued. Prior to that bond issue, we had raised property taxes less than what we could have. This chart is a little difficult to see, but it is on the city's website. I don't believe it is in the handout, but it is on the city's website. And it just shows what we did levy and what the increases and decreases were over the 9 years that we were home rule community, what we could have levied as if we were under the tax cap, and then also the 9 years prior when we were under the tax cap, what our increases were. And the reason for that is under the tax cap, you're limited to the lower of the consumer price index change, or 5%. And in those 9 prior years, the CPI was higher than it was during the recession. But as a non-home rule community, we did raise property taxes each year because it was our only funding source. And then this is just a breakout to show of your property tax dollars. Of each dollar, 8 cents goes to the city of Batavia, and then that breakdown shows the other taxing bodies' portion of your tax bill. That doesn't say what it should. It says each year the city levies property taxes sufficient to pay its annual payment on its outstanding general obligation bonded debt. That is not true. We only have our bridge debt on the property tax rolls. We could levy for all of our obligation bonds, but we use home rule revenues to offset that. If the city were to put those bonds on the tax rolls, because debt is not subject to the tax cap, so the city has the ability to do that, but it hasn't ever since I've been here. We've only levied for the City Hall back in the 90s, and then the bridge. But if we did levy, it would cause an increase of $325 to someone that has a $300,000 home. So we just wanted to show there what the savings is by having alternate revenue sources so that we don't have to rely on property taxes.
Good evening. As Lori indicated, my name is Dan Ewell. I'm the Chief of Police here. And regarding legislative authority, I'm going to speak specifically about the crime-free multi-housing program we enacted in 2011. And I think Kevin has some follow-up information about more legislative authority. As you can see there, the ordinance was enacted in 2011. And it was originally, in concept phase, a rental housing inspection and full crime-free multi-housing program. That means that there was a community development piece to it where there was inspection of the internal workings of the home, and then a full-blown crime-free multi-housing program that would have been all-encompassing down to single-family rental structures. Through the course of open meetings and public discussions, it was pared down. Rental housing was stripped, and the crime-free multi-housing program was also pared down to include originally units, dwellings of 8 units or more, and then I believe in 2013 it was reduced a little bit more to encompass multi-units of 6 units or more. As you can see here, we have 2 program managers. They both do this as supplemental duties, so we did not hire any existing personnel, and that was part of the decision-making process that we didn't go down to the single-family dwellings. We just did not have the personnel, and at the time, 2011, we were trending in the opposite direction. We were stripping personnel, we weren't adding personnel. So when we implemented the program in 2011, we came up with a training program for landlords and management teams in the multi-family family complexes. These were some of the topical items of the training sessions we hosted in 2011 and 2012 in mass, and then we do it periodically as maintenance when new managers come on board or when somebody requests some additional training. Really, the meat of the program is the crime-free lease addendum. I'll get into more detail on that a little bit later. And then we talk about some other things with the landowners as well. CPTED, which is an acronym for Crime Prevention Through Environmental Design. And really that's us going through inspecting the physical aspects of the exterior of the properties, making sure the screens are in place, that there are locks, the exterior locks for the external doors work, that the lights are all operative, and those sorts of things to abate crime in that regard. Talk about, give them some options about applicant screening for prospective tenants, talking about the community rules and leases, give them some templates for lease agreements they can sign with, in addition to the addendum with their rental occupants, and then talk about the partnership with police and how the non-compliance situation is worked through. Currently, like I said, it's up to 8 units at this point. I think I said that in reverse. Actually, we started with 6 and now it's 8. We have about 844 units that are governed by the crime-free housing multi-housing program, so it's quite expansive. So the question that has been asked, I think, a number of times I've read on social media and in the news is, why did we go to crime-free housing? We knew for a long time that there was a disparity in call for service volume between multifamily housing structures and single-family residential neighborhoods. In 2009, pre-2011, our strategy was saturation patrolling. We just spent more time there than we did in other places, and at the time we had more officers. So in 2009, we had 45 officers in the department. We stripped our first officer there between 2011. We went down to an authorized end strength of 40 officers, so it was a loss of over 10,000 man-hours in sworn police services. And we realized we needed to determine alternate strategies to be able to provide preventive police services to the entirety of the community. And I go back to the disparity. In some places we were responding to some of the multifamily complexes 6.5 to 7 times more often and frequently than we were in similar-sized residential neighborhoods. So we just couldn't spend as much time there because we didn't have as many people on the street. That's sworn patrol forces, the line forces, and then would have been supplemented by investigative personnel. And in all areas, I think we lost 3 in the administrative section between that time and 2 in the patrol sworn force. And then we adopted, or I should say the City Council adopted the ordinance at the end of 2011. I believe it was in November of 2011. So what does it cover? Engaging in criminal activity on or off the premises. So if we find out, that's more difficult for us to do, but if we find out that somebody was involved in criminal activity even off premises, that was a reason for enacting the crime-free components. Basically, any other illegal activity or anything that would threaten the health or welfare of the other people who live in the complex. Okay, so these are some of the standard violations, and this is kind of how the crime-free housing addendum is laid out, and this is really the meat of the program. Violations of any provision is a material breach of the lease and cause for immediate termination. And it doesn't require a conviction, only a preponderance of evidence. This is a civil ordinance. So it's an administrative action more than anything else, where nobody's getting arrested for a violation of crime-free multi-housing. They just may lose their housing as a result. Residents, when they sign the crime-free lease agreement, they must authorize the property management to use reports that are generated that have them as subjects in them to share between the police department and the management team. Residents are not only held responsible for their own actions, but for people whose actions they bring on the property. And that has a lot of teeth, because one thing we found before the enactment of the crime-free housing ordinance was that in many of these places when we didn't have visibility and nor did the management teams, there was a lot of subletting going on. So somebody would lease an apartment and they wouldn't live there. We'd find out if we were dealing with somebody, talk to the management team on site, give them names, and they say they don't live here. And then we talk to residents who were around that property, and they would say, well, those are the only people I've ever known to live in there. So we knew that was occurring. The subletting was unauthorized, but it was also problematic for us. So this is kind of a snapshot of what we've seen crime-free multi-housing and post 2008 to 2010. I'm sorry, 2008 to 2011. You see, it was trending downward, but the calls for service were extremely high. Like I said, 6.5 to 7 times greater than a similar sized residential neighborhood. 2011, we enacted the ordinance. It was still on a downward trend. In 2012, they spiked. People say, well, I've heard it said that, well, crime-free isn't working because obviously it spiked after you enacted the ordinance. It must be the problem. Again, this is a kind of a transition year where we were dealing with saturation patrolling as one strategy and then going to this administrative ordinance as another. So I think there was a little bit of transition there, and I'll further illustrate that. I would also say that saturation patrolling comes with a downside. And in simple terms, in my experience as a law enforcement officer, if a squad car goes to your neighborhood once a day and waves, it makes people happy. If you see 4 police cars on the block for 3 hours, it makes people nervous. And if you have squad cars in your neighborhood every day for extended periods of time, it tends to make people angry. And that was one of the end results of the saturation patrolling that we had strategy we've been employing prior to crime-free multi-housing. So every year since 2012, when we changed strategies, you can see there's a standard downward trend there. And even in 2012, and I'm going to show you the next pie chart here, 2012, this was the first year where we had full-blown crime-free housing. Only one of the 8 complexes that were governed by crime-free housing went up in percentage of calls. The others went down. And then the next year, all 8 of them were trending downwards and have maintained that downward trajectory ever since. So the bottom line is we believe that the crime-free multi-housing program has been successful just based on the downward trend in the overall statistics. The biggest component of that is that the tenants know the rules prior to taking up residence there, and we think that has been the greatest had the greatest deterrent effect over time. When they sign a lease agreement, they know they're going to engage in criminal activity. They don't want to move there because they know they'll be evicted eventually, or they'll have their lease not renewed. So as an example of why we think that's the case, in the last 18 months since I've been appointed the chief of police, we have not requested any evictions in any of the units that are governed under crime-free multi-housing. So we believe that means that things are going well, and we're not seeing the frequent repeat calls at the specific addresses in the units that are governed by crime-free housing. Most importantly, I think it has increased the partnership between the police department and the landowners and the management teams that are on site at these multifamily housing complexes. And it's made things easier for us when we're dealing with the management teams with problems on or around the rental properties. A couple of examples would be a couple of years back we had a neighborhood issue where visitors were parking in the neighborhoods and staying overnight and getting overnight parking violations rather than parking in the parking lots because they had limited visitor parking space, and if they were caught in a tenant space, they would get towed. So they would rather take a $15 overnight parking violation than get towed out of the complex. But it caused consternation in the neighborhood, so we talked to the management team that we had a relationship with based on crime-free housing, and they agreed to increase their visitor parking spaces. Second example, and I think is the most we're most proud of, is that in 2012 we had a spike in one of the apartment complexes, and that's our most dense residential property structure, the Batavia Apartments. And those folks saw us a lot in between 2008 and 2011. They still see us often, but it's in a different way now. Last year they called us and asked us to perform a trick-or-treat event on the site there. So we brought a bunch of our police officers out there with a lot of our equipment, brought in the sheriff's department, and let the kids jump around in the cars and the trucks, and handed out candy and handed out crime prevention paraphernalia, and they were extremely happy about it. 10 years ago, 7 years ago, I'm not sure that would have occurred, and it hadn't occurred. And they just recently called us back again this year for another trick-or-treat event, so we're very happy about that. And now I think I'm going to turn it over to Kevin Drendel, who's going to finish up.
Actually, me.
Oh, you, I'm sorry.
That's all right.
I blew it.
At this time, before I finish up with this last slide, if you have written down a question, if you want to go ahead and pass it outward, both Chris Cudworth and Anthony will be happy to pick up your cards, because very shortly we're going to get started answering those questions. But before we conclude the presentation, I think it's important to note Okay, so while they're going around collecting the cards, on this slide, we just wanted to point out the different ways that residents oversee the use of home rule. First and foremost, you can oversee the use of home rule by participating in City Council and Committee of the Whole meetings. Anyone can address the governing body at every meeting. There's always an item on the agenda that says matters from the public for items not on the agenda, and you can come in and talk about anything that you'd like to talk about with your city council. As well, each individual agenda item, you're encouraged to stand up and give your opinion and give your advice to city council as they vote on a subject. Secondly, I also want to point out those meetings are all broadcast on VATV as well, so you don't have to show up in person. You can watch them at home or at your leisure. Secondly, all documents are published and discussed in open session prior to them being voted upon. And they're posted on the city's website at least 48 hours before they're going to come before the governing body. And then there's the budget process. That's the time when the spending plans for the coming year are made, and it provides the authorization and direction for how funds are going to be allocated. The budget is made available to the public at the end of October, and there are several meetings in November over which it's discussed and then finally approved in December. But a public opinion may be given at any time, either by attending those meetings or seeing the budget that's been published online and providing comments either to city staff or to your alderman. The law requires that if a property increase is going to be greater than 5%, then the city council, there has to be an open session with a public hearing. And the city council will discuss it over several meetings where the public can speak before the council will act upon it. And finally, residents elect your representatives on the city council through a selection of a council person in their ward. And every 2 years, half of the aldermen are elected for 4-year terms, and the mayor is elected every 4 years. So with that, Chris, were you going to come up to the podium and read one of the questions for us to respond to?
And it looks like we have enough that we should be able to get through them.
Nice.
Okay. The first question is, what would change in your relationship with the apartments if home rule went away? Would you stop communicating and policing?
Well, the answer is no, with the caveat. There will be certain things we would not be able to share with the property management teams on the site with the rental properties were home rule to go away. So the information we share, and like I said, part of the lease agreement is they have to sign an acknowledgement to understand that the residents understand we are going to be sharing information. Then it would be subject to FOIA, honestly, and we would be able to communicate with them less or give them less information than we are currently doing. So yeah, that would be a reduction. So yes, we would continue to maintain a relationship, and we would communicate with them, but we would be able to provide them less information.
The next question is, will the PPA, which stands for Purchase Power Adjustment, in our electric bill go away by keeping home rule?
When I had discussed that there are sub companies or funds within the city, the electric utility is its own company, and it is to be supported by the electric rates. The exception to that was when we did use the home rule sales tax for a short time to kind of stave off any rate increases. The purchase power adjustment factor allows us to smooth out the bills over the year because power prices go up and down throughout the year, each month. And so rather than having that change, we utilize that to keep rates smooth. And so no, it wouldn't be affected by home rule either way.
I would just add that there are some areas of regulation in which even home rule entities are preempted. And utilities is one area in which the statewide regulation preempts local home rule regulation in that aspect.
The next question is, how is the city of Batavia funding Shodine's property on Route 25 in Wilson?
So the agreement that the city has with Shodine is called a redevelopment agreement, and the redevelopment agreement is part of the TIF Act, and TIF allows a community in an area of blight to utilize the incremental tax value that would be created by a development in order to fund that development's creation. And so the answer is that the city is funding the development with the future tax increments. It is not funding it through taxpayer or tax dollars.
The next question is, does the city of Geneva have home rule, yes or no?
They do not.
Can you still have crime-free housing projects passed on a referendum without home rule, yes or no?
No. Is that correct, Kevin?
Right.
No, it is a authority given only to units of home rule.
The next question is, what are the complaints expressed by those who signed the referendum?
You know, I guess it's that I'd hate to try to express someone else's opinion. I'd feel that they should express their opinion. I would hate to misstate it.
Okay. What is the source of funds used for a large Washington apartment complex to be developed? I think we answered this question already. With the downward trend in calls for service already in effect before crime-free housing, how can you claim crime-free housing is responsible for the continuing downward trend? Why were calls just decreasing before crime-free housing?
Well, again, I would base it on our strategy. We were spending a lot of time in the multifamily housing dwellings, and we think that had an impact on it as well. We have not seen that type of decline in calls for service in the rest of our police activities in the same period of time. Maybe they remain static, or sometimes there's an uptick, a downtick, but this has been a standard downward trend, and which is kind of important to us right now because we are spending more and more contact time on calls now than ever. There is a mental health crisis in the state of Illinois and probably throughout the nation, but the funding crisis at the state level has really pushed a lot of the shouldering of the burden for mental health and dealing with the mentally ill down to the lowest level, and that is the police on the street, honestly. When nobody else knows what to do, they call us, and these are calls that are very sensitive, and they require a lot of time. The officer, when I started as a police officer in the middle 90s, you had a clock going in your head, and so did your boss. And, it took 20 minutes to do this, an hour and 15 minutes to do that. And if you spent more time than that on your contact, the boss was going to be in your ear. It's just totally changed the work environment for law enforcement officers throughout the country because we cannot respond to calls anymore on a clock. We have to work them through safely to limit risks and liability and injury to ourselves and to the people we're dealing with. And a reduction in any area of calls for service assists us in doing that and providing, putting more officers on calls than we normally would under conventional circumstances.
Why does the Legal Counsel of Geneva and Westmont say that a stormwater utility would require a referendum for non-home rule municipalities? Wouldn't Batavia require a referendum if voters vote down home rule and a city wants to implement a stormwater utility?
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, it's long. Why does the Legal Counsel of Geneva and Westmont say that a stormwater utility would require a referendum for non-home rule municipalities? Wouldn't Batavia require a referendum if voters vote down home rule and the city wants to implement a stormwater utility?
I'm not familiar with either of those decisions. Kevin, would you like to comment?
Well, I think the only comment that I could give is that they probably have done some research and come to that conclusion through legal research. That's not something that we've researched because we're home rule. Obviously, if home rule authority is voted down, that might be something that we would have to take a look at. But I couldn't answer as to why at this point myself.
Perhaps that's one that we could provide an answer to through the follow-up.
Okay.
I think it requires a little more examination. We have a question. What was the difference in interest rates in 2006 versus 2012 when the fire station bonds were refinanced? How much of a savings would there have been had the 2006 bonds been refinanced without home rule in 2012?
There was definitely a reduction in interest rates from the time that those bonds were issued to when they were refunded. We refunded all of our outstanding debt from 2009 through 2013, or 2015 was our last refunding, to save interest. The portion that's attributable to home rule would be between 0.3 and 0.5%. So on that particular bond issue, I can't say exactly what the percentage was because it was home rule, but I did go back and do an analysis of our interest savings on our other types of debt that we refunded with general obligation bonds, and those totaled $2 million. That was just attributable to the city having home rule authority and the interest savings that on all of our debt.
There's a question for Chief Huell. How many evictions have there been since crime-free housing took effect that couldn't have happened without the ordinance? Since the real, quote, teeth of the ordinance is eviction, shouldn't that be the measure of success?
The answer to that question is we don't track that actively. Like I said, since I've been the chief of police, we have not requested anybody be evicted during that span of time. In addition to evictions, there is also non-renewal of lease as a strategy for the management teams. Now, anecdotally, I can tell you that in 2012, in one of the training presentation slideshows, one of the major complexes indicated they had issued 11 eviction notices at that time. And that's in addition to non-renewals of leases. So between 2012 and 2018, we've gone from possibly 11 at one complex to 0 across the board.
And if I could just add to that, I think one of the greatest measures of success would be if there was some way to measure that having this changed people's behavior. But that's why we put the addendum in the lease, is so that people realize when they sign that lease that there's a consequence to engaging in those behaviors. So if only there was a way to measure how many people didn't engage in that activity, that really would be the best measure of success.
This one relates to it. It's phrased a little bit differently. I think it was asked in the moment here, are you saying we will lose the crime-free housing program without home rule? Why? How much? Well, let's answer that one first.
That's an area, so a non-home rule entity must find its authority in state legislation, mostly in the Illinois Municipal Code, in order to be able to exercise authority. And being able to exercise authority over private property owners in that way is not something that is granted by the state legislatures. So that's why that would be one area of authority that would go away if home rule is repealed.
And the second half of that question was, how much extra does it cost each year?
Like I said at the beginning of my presentation, we did not add any additional personnel, so it's using existing personnel in their standard 40-hour work week. We don't do hire back for this. It's just a supplementary task for those two program managers who also carry an investigative workload. So the only answer would be in potential lost productivity with investigation follow-ups and that sort of thing. But it's not any extra money coming out for the crime-free housing program.
There was a question here that relates to part of the presentation. It says, what is your estimate of home rule taxes paid by non-Batavia residents?
I don't think that we have any way of being able to tell what percentage of the tax is paid by non-residents, but I do know that 100% of the property tax is paid by Batavia property owners.
What spending adjustments are anticipated if home rule is abandoned, if any? Is there a home rule effect on home values? Crime fee, I think it says higher taxes imply lower home values. Should I repeat that?
Yeah, I didn't understand that last part.
Yeah, it's kind of posed in the reverse. The first part is what spending adjustments are anticipated if home rule is abandoned? Let's start with that one.
Sure. We're in the process right now of preparing our 2019 budget, keeping in mind that this could change the direction of the budget considerably. Certainly, as I mentioned, 73% of our budget is for people, and that makes it difficult in order to say specifically what could be cut from the budget. Our contracts are all for important services, dispatch services, ambulance services, forestry. Maybe we could not trim the trees back so much and those kinds of things, but to come up with even $1 million in cuts would be very difficult without going to personnel.
In the second half of that question, is there a home rule effect on home values?
That would be something that would have to be part of a home rule study, and I couldn't comment on that. Okay, this question asks, if Batavia loses home rule, what will that do to our bond rating as a city? Will we have to pay back the bonds we currently have at a higher rate than what they were issued at? No, we would not have to reissue those bonds. As a non-home rule city, they were issued when we were home rule, and we can keep those in place. There is an impact generally. I've been working with Moody's Investor Service for almost 30 years, and whenever you do a bond issue, you talk with them in person, and they ask you about the management of the city's council's willingness to use property tax if it has to, and those kinds of things. And they always tell me that home rule definitely plays a part in the rating.
The second part of the question on this card was directed to the Chief of Police. Have you seen a change in the people living and or visiting the crime-free housing? In your opinion, do you think it is, if we lose crime-free housing, would there be an increase in crime issues with drugs and violence?
I can't answer that question. It would be speculation on my part. I can tell you that, like I said, our relationships have improved since the implementation of crime-free housing. We're not as heavy a footprint in these locations anymore. I think that improves our relationship. They smile a lot more at us when we are in there, and now they're asking us to come back there. And like I said, I don't think that that was occurring because of the frequency with which we were spending time in there beforehand. Now, that being said, if the laws change, we will adapt to that. We will employ different measures and hopefully continue the forward progress we have made since 2011 when this was implemented. When I started as a police officer, it was a felony to drive around the car with a gun, and now it's, people are permitted and carrying them legally. There's been no expansive changes. We haven't, had a spike in shootings. And when I started as a police officer, all drugs were illegal, and now they're not all illegal. Illegal, and now they're not all illegal. And we haven't had any explosion in drug crime of that nature at this point. So speculation on my part, but we would hope not.
The next question, from the phrasing here, I'm not sure we're allowed to answer these, but I'll ask them, okay? It says, what is the rationale to give up home rule? Well, which Illinois municipalities, if any, have given up their home rule? And the third part is, what organizations, agencies, or parties have advocated giving up home rule?
I can take a stab at the first part of that.
Okay.
I wouldn't speculate on what the rationale is. I haven't really, tried to come up with a definitive rationale, but I can tell you that there are only 6 communities, I believe, that have given up home rule, and the way it happens is with a referendum.
Keep talking to the mic.
The way it happens is with a referendum. Either a referendum that's driven by a petition, where the citizens have required the question to be put to a vote, or in situations where a municipality has gone below the 25,000, which is what automatically triggers home rule, in which case at the next election a referendum question is required to be put to the voters as to whether they want to keep home rule. Or of course a municipality could petition itself to the question to the voters. I can't tell you exactly how all of those 6 communities that have repealed home rule got to the question. I suspect that there were some that probably fell below the 25,000, and that others were probably triggered by a petition by the citizenry. But there isn't a lot of data in regard to municipalities that have lost home rule, because there are only 6 since 1970 when the Constitution was passed.
Is that 6 nationwide, or is it 6 Illinois?
6 Illinois.
Okay. And the last part of that, maybe we could still respond to this. What organizations, agencies, or parties have advocated giving up home rule?
I don't know myself.
Okay. Perhaps we can.
I think that the citizen group who filed the petition in Batavia, they had a meeting and they had some representatives from some organizations that oppose home rule.
Okay. Does the council vote on all issues and areas detailed in the comprehensive plan, but not limited to the plan? And if so, is a supermajority required for approval?
Can you ask that question again?
Yeah. I feel like a lawyer up here, right? Sorry, Kevin.
or a witness.
Or a witness. Yeah. Fortunately, I haven't been that much. Does the council vote on all issues and areas detailed in the comprehensive plan, but not limited to the plan? And if so, is a supermajority required for approval?
I don't think I could answer that. I'm not sure exactly what the question is getting at. I mean, I suppose if we're talking about various decisions that impact on the comprehensive plan, there are decisions that could require supermajorities as well as decisions that only require a majority. It really depends on the type of decision that's being made that is impacting or reflected in the comprehensive plan, so that's really impossible to answer, I think.
I'm going to play FOIA officer here and ask if the person who submitted this question wanted to clarify in any way, or did that answer your question? Yeah.
Kind of, yes.
Why don't you come up? Yeah, we're not going to do that a lot, but if you're going to ask a question, please ask it through so we can get the clarification.
My question was really, when the council votes on anything, do they require a supermajority? Trying to figure out how everything gets passed, because I'm new within the community.
Okay.
And so in other words, 10 out of 15.
Right.
As I saw, there's 15 members, 14 councilmen and a mayor. So that's what I'm asking.
Okay, that's a good question.
Okay.
Thank you.
So the answer really is, it depends. So the default answer is a majority. A majority of the council excluding the mayor. That's the default. But then there are different types of votes that require different types of votes. So in other words, an annexation agreement requires 2/3 vote to approve it. There are decisions to purchase property typically requires a supermajority. There are quite a few actually types of votes that require more than a majority, and and whenever more than a majority vote is required, the mayor typically can vote in those instances. So most of that we default back to the Illinois statutes in terms of the voting that's required. It would be an interesting exercise, I suppose, to consider whether we could change that by home rule authority. The fact is that we don't, that we typically rely on the statutory requirement for the voting, and it could be that we're actually preempted from changing that. It's not an issue that I've actually looked into, but the answer is it really depends on the type of vote, and the requirement for each type of vote is set by state statute.
And by practice, there's typically legal counsel at every council or committee of the whole meeting. The question is, what new businesses have been brought to Batavia since the master plan was designed in 2008 to help broaden the tax base? It's a big question.
Well, we certainly saw the opening of a very successful retail business off of Randall Road in Sierra Trading Company. I'm no longer able to find any parking space in the entire parking lot over there. That seems pretty successful. We've had many businesses that have, there you go, Art Van Furniture, Bye Bye Baby.
I would hate to miss saying
I know.
That might be a good
You know,
one
one
that
of the
we could
things-
do follow-up.
You can, and the other thing that you can do is you can look at the monthly financial reports, and the monthly financial reports contain a graph that shows month by month the amount of sales tax that the city collects, and I think that that would be a good reflection of how there has been a steady increase in that over time.
The next question asks, where does the group that opposes home rule plan to get the money to run the government without interruption of services? Where do they think the city will get the money without home rule?
Wrong meeting.
It was asked.
It's a very
so.
good question.
How much revenue is projected to be lost from home rule taxes paid by non-residents, in essence, sales tax, gasoline tax, liquor tax, etc.? And the second part of that question is, how would this lost revenue be made up?
Well, part of that question says that it's paid by non-residents. As we already answered, we don't know what portion is paid by residents and what portion is paid by non-residents. But our total home rule revenues that we collect right now amount to about $5.2 million. Part of that could be restored through a referendum for a non-home rule sales tax. If we were to put that on the ballot and it was successful, there would be a period of 6 months where we would lose at least $1 million, possibly $2 million in sales tax. And that is, we've asked the question to special legal counsel in regards to whether or not we could retain the home rule sales tax that was passed with a referendum prior to us being home rule. And the question was, it depends, which means that it needs further research because there just isn't enough cases out there where that's been the case. There actually probably hasn't been any where that was the situation here in Illinois. The cities that lost home rule, most of them were in the 70s and early 80s. There was only one in recent history that I'm aware of, and that was in 2012. And they had to repeal their home rule sales tax.
By circumstance, the next question is, how did the city of Batavia pay for everything prior to 2009? $5.2 million is a huge number in such a short time.
It is a huge number. We did have the 0.5% non-home rule sales tax that was converted to home rule that I was just referring to. So we had those revenues already, which were $1.9 million. But then the other taxes is the additional 0.5%, and then the gas tax and the liquor tax. And the answer is our operating costs go up every year because we 73% of our expenses are related to personnel. I did a year-by-year analysis, and that increased less than the CPI each year overall in those 9 years. So it wasn't just that. We were holding the line on that, but then we also have pensions that we have to fund, which are mandated by the state, and those have gone up considerably in the last 9 years. And also health insurance costs have risen.
Just by way of measure, we have about eight more questions. So
I think there's something that probably should be said in response to that question also in regard to the fact that we entered into a recession right at the time that the city reached that home rule level in 2009. And obviously the city did cut personnel and cut costs, but also the city was able to sustain a lot of the services that were provided through that time by adding the non-home rule revenue without having to add that burden onto the property taxes of the property owners in the city. So I think that part of the answer in regard to that high number is the fact that we did go through a recession and had to find ways of raising tax to at least keep some of the services that we had without further cuts.
this question says, how, when there is no tax increment to collect today and in the future until property is sold to Shodine and built upon, will the project be financed? TIF funds are tax dollars, are they not?
It is on the future tax increment, so unless the project is going to get built, the bonds would not be issued. So that is the guarantee. In addition to that, there are several measures of security within the redevelopment agreement that will prevent property taxes from being used for anything. Those are a special service area The developer has agreed that in the early stages of the development, where there is only public improvement of the public parking garage, that they will make the bond payments on the early until increment is generated to be paying the bonds. And as well, there is a performance bond associated with the project, such that in the event that the developer is not able to carry out the development, that bond pays the city to be able to complete the development and collect the revenue in the future.
Just one clarification is that there are property taxes involved, but the property taxes are those that are generated from that property,
Yes.
which result from the increased assessed valuation when it gets built out, which generates additional property tax, but it's the tax generated from that particular property.
There was a related
General
question.
property, just to clarify, general property taxes will not pay that bond. They are not. It's the project itself that's paying it, and the properties located within that TIF.
And there was a related question posted on the flyer brought in. Why is the city involved in the purchasing of real estate?
It is not uncommon, especially in areas that have been designated as TIF, for a city to collect property sufficient to become a future development area in order to maximize the amount of development that can be done in that area. In this case, we were able to acquire about 3/4 of what that city block would be, greatly increasing the amount of potential revenue that could be generated in order to afford a public parking structure that we really need in our downtown area.
I guess for the record, there were 2 other comments on here that weren't necessarily questions, but we'll put them into the record. It says aldermen should be involved in informing their precincts on issues brought before the city council which involve our tax monies. And he also commented, lastly, there are many residents on fixed incomes who plan ahead and adjust for rainy day repairs and expenditures. He'd like to see a check on frivolous spending, such as the fancy brickwork on the sewage treatment plant. So there just some commentary there that didn't maybe qualify as questions, but putting them into the public sphere, and perhaps that'll come up in some other context. Who determines how funds, home rule or otherwise, are dispersed? Who determines how funds, home rule or otherwise, are dispersed?
So the city staff develop recommendations, and then what they do is they bring those recommendations along with all of the, along with the factual bases for those recommendations to the city council. And so oftentimes a memorandum is prepared that illustrates both sides and the potential downfalls and pluses of doing it this way and the pros and cons of doing it that way. And then the city council looks at that information. They debate about what the decision will be. Oftentimes they'll look back to staff and say, you know what? Just not ready to make a decision about this. There's some more information that we would like to have before we go ahead and make a decision. And so they'll postpone their decision. We'll go back and conduct that research, bring it back to them. And any public meeting, there is always the opportunity not only to speak to an item that is on the agenda, but anything else that the public would like to talk to City Council about.
Does the tax cap apply only to the city government? Does it apply to the school district?
I think it applies, to the school district as well.
Yes, it does. Right. The tax cap applies to all cities that are in the collar counties. It does not apply to cities in southern Illinois, so it applies to all of the surrounding counties of Chicago that are not a home rule entity, and it always applies to the school districts and park districts and libraries.
This question is written in red. It says, does the city have a balanced budget? Are the city's finances audited by an independent auditor?
Yes, the city's finances are audited. Since 2012, we've been audited by Sikich and Company. They're a well-respected governmental auditing firm. And since the city started applying for the award for excellence in financial reporting by the Government Finance Officers Association back in 2007, we've received the award every year. And what that means is that we follow the highest standards in our financial reporting. And then the other portion of that question is, does the city have a balanced budget? And some people feel that a balanced budget is that revenues always equal expenditures. But that's not always the case, because in some years you collect more revenues than you spend. And in some years you plan for capital projects. When you have a big capital project, you're going to draw down that savings, so then you won't have a balanced budget. But for the operating portion, the city is always looking at making sure that our revenue stream will cover our ongoing operations.
Next question has how many city employees?
We have 150 full-time employees and about 70 part-time, which a large portion of that part-time is our paid-on-call firefighters.
I'm kind of going to pair these next two questions. The first is, why was this added to the referendum this year? And the second question that goes with it is, once a city decides on non-home rule, can they decide to return to home rule at a later date?
I can take the first part of that. An individual citizen filed a petition with a sufficient number of signatures to put this question on the ballot. So it wasn't anything that the city did to put the question on the ballot. It was a petition that was received. And then the second part of the question was?
Once a city decides on non-home rule, can they decide to return to home rule at a later date?
I think the answer to that is yes. Kevin?
Yeah, it would have to happen the same way. It would be, a referendum would be required. I believe there's a time period after repeal of home rule that no referendum could be put forward, but after that time period, then another citizen group or the city council could put the question on the ballot to the voters again. But that would be the way it would have to work.
This one's listed off topic. Why is there no overnight parking downtown? By having bars, then you're saying you can't park overnight, you're making it harder for people to not drink and drive.
I'm sorry, can you ask that question again?
Well, yeah. Why, the first part, why is there no overnight parking downtown?
There's no overnight parking throughout the entirety of the city, except in very specific in a few areas.
Downtown is one of them. If you get a...
But the sort of the question statement that was the second part of this question was, by having bars, et cetera, then saying you can't park overnight, you're making it harder for people to not drink and drive.
Okay, first of all, just for clarity, there is a permitting process for downtown residents, people who live in the apartments above the businesses in the downtown area. In addition to that, we do have a very liberal permitting process for things of that very nature, not just in the downtown district, but throughout the community. If somebody has overnight guests, people coming in from out of town, somebody who came for a meal or a party and had too much, they can call us, let us know they're going to be parked on the street overnight, and they will not be cited.
Thank you. And our last question tonight, unless anything, what are the immediate and long-term benefits of home rule for the city of Batavia?
Well, I think I'd roll right back to the slide where we took a look at what the differences are between home rule and non-home rule. I think this pretty much kind of sums it up here. And it has to do with home rule units being allowed to do things that your elected officials see as beneficial to this local community. so long as it's not specifically accepted from doing that by the state, versus being non-home rule where, as a community, we would only have those rights which the state has specifically granted to us. So I think that's probably the most important difference, and that's both immediate and long-term, I'd say. One of the examples we gave of issuing the debt was to address the drainage issues that existed. And did the drainage issues exist for quite some time? Yes, they certainly did. But they really kind of came to a head in the flooding that we experienced in 2015. And during the recession, we just simply did not have the resources in order to deal with that issue. So one of the long-term aspects of being able to have home rule is also being able to take a short term, in the short term, be able to take actions like those in the best interests of the community.
I would add, too, that it allows for creativity. I can say from having represented non-home rule entities that whenever something, a solution is being investigated or a course of action is being considered, one of those considerations is, can we do it? So there's a lot of time spent in research trying to determine, number one, can we do what we want to do in order to address this local issue? And number two, how can we do it? There's a lot of research that goes into that. In representing a home rule community and in, as a council member or a staff member, that isn't the first question that you ask when an issue comes up and there's a consideration in regard to, okay, what do we do now? So it kind of changes the thinking to allow kind of some more creativity, because you're no longer constrained by the limitations that are preset by the state legislature. Now, that doesn't eliminate necessarily all the research that might have to happen, because sometimes you have to be worried about, okay, has the state preempted us? It's a different question, rather than looking for, okay, can we do this, and if so, how, and going to the municipal code and trying to figure it out. It is, okay, we just need to make sure that we aren't preempted in doing this particular thing. But it does allow more creativity. That was the purpose expressed by the people who drafted the Constitution, was to allow home rule communities to have that ability to tailor solutions to local problems, rather than being constrained by this kind of uniform structure that is imposed by the state.
In going forward, by way of continuing communication on home rule information, two things. If any of you come away from tonight's meeting and have additional questions, Laura Newman, our city administrator, has put her cards up front here. For those of you who might be listening through BATV, that address is lnewman@cityofbatavia.net. And what we're doing with questions that are submitted to us is creating a master document that now exists on the City of Batavia website. There's a link to that page on the home page, the front page of the city's website, which will take you directly to the home rule information page. All questions are welcome, and we will provide the best information we have and have that dialogue. So that invitation remains open, and we just wanted you to know that. That kind of concludes the formal part. Did you have some?
I just wanted to thank everybody for coming to the meeting tonight. I honestly didn't know how many people to expect at this meeting tonight, and I am so glad to see dozens of people here tonight. But that's Batavia. We've got so many residents who are deeply interested in our community, and when important questions like this come up, you guys always show up. So, and you've made this a better meeting tonight. We tried to anticipate what information that you would like to know when you were making a decision how to vote, but I thank you for each and every one of the questions. You made the presentation better with your questions. So, and my last thing is, no matter what your opinion is on whether we should be home rule or we shouldn't be home rule, it's such an important question that please vote. So thank you very much.